everyone. Thanks for joining me today. The 1st of June, the beginning of Pride Month, the end of what everyone was calling Meltdown May. Hopefully we'll have a seamless stream today. I know that I've been having some Wi-Fi issues in my household, so forgive me if I run into any problems there. I have a lot of things that I want to start with today, but I think I'll start with what I was doing actually right before I started this live stream. I was phone banking, but not for me this time. I was actually phone banking for Michaela Wilkes, who is running in Maryland, in Maryland's 5th District, which is right outside of DC. So spent some time phone banking for her because Maryland's election is actually tomorrow, and it is moved to a predominantly mail-in election, mail-in ballots. So calling for her and trying to make sure that people have their ballots in, and if they don't have them in, where they know where they can drop them off, so that we can ensure that Michaela gets all the votes that she deserves, because I'm incredibly excited about the campaign that she's run and the platform that she's running on and the prospect of her being a congresswoman. We obviously need more Black women in Congress, but on top of that, she's running on incredibly great policies as well. Things that really align with the platform that I'm running on, like Medicare for All and the Green New Deal, legalizing marijuana, getting money out of politics. She has a great view on criminal justice reform because she herself was caught up in our racist criminal justice system as a teen, and she saw firsthand how that system can keep Black and brown people in a cycle of poverty, in and out of incarceration. And we absolutely need people like her in Congress who bring that type of life experience and that perspective into the legislative body, who will be able to bring that lens, look at things through that lens when they are legislating. So, as I mentioned, she's running in the Democratic primary. She's running against Steny Hoyer, who is the House Majority Leader in Maryland's 5th District, like I said, outside of DC. So if you know anyone who lives in that district, it's DC, part of Prince George's County, Charles County, Anne Arundel, St. Mary's, and Calvert. Please tell friends and family who are there to get their ballots in and ideally cast those ballots for Michaela. Like I said, the election is tomorrow. While I want you to stay here with me this evening, you can always go and phone bank for her this evening or any time during the day tomorrow. So you can visit her website at michaela2020.com if you want to check her out and sign up to volunteer to help her get out the vote in these next few hours, frankly. We're talking like 24 hours until that election is over. So that's kind of the highlight. I feel like everything else that I've thought about talking about today is really the lowlights. I think a lot has obviously happened since we talked last week. We as a country saw the murder of George Floyd at the hands of the state, the hands of the police. If anyone watched video of that, they know how horrific and cruel and inhumane it was. Particularly not just the man with his knee on George's neck, but all of the officers who stood around and watched as that happened, watched as he choked out his last breath and died. And rightfully so, people across Minneapolis, people across the country as a whole have stood up once again to say that Black Lives Matter, that police brutality needs to absolutely end. And the conversation, I think, is going to continue, and this protest and the fight is not going to go quietly. I think that it's too many people are really at their breaking points now. When you combine this with the completely inhumane response we've seen from our government in response to a pandemic, that has led to millions of people being out of jobs. People are absolutely tired of this now. They are tired of being treated like they don't matter. And that is exponentially true for Black people who feel in danger from policing in our country at any moment. And that is the thing that when I participated in the protests and the marches in Wilmington this weekend, I heard the most from anyone, is that multiple people just saying, I'm so tired of this. No one wants to make another hashtag for the next Black person who dies at the hands of police. There was a man at the march in Wilmington walking around with a sign with the names of everyone that he knew of that had at least been reported that were killed by police. And it was interesting to see that he started writing on the sign in larger letters, and he quickly realized that there were so many names that he had to fit on that sign that he had to shrink them down just to be able to get them all on there. And he walked around that entire protest reminding people that at any moment their name could be added to that list. And that is the reason that everyone was out there, because that's how people feel. At any moment, another Black person's name can be added to that list simply for being Black and coming into contact with policing in our country. It was an amazing protest to be part of. I began listening to speeches and people talk in Rodney Square and joined the march as it headed down Walnut Street in Wilmington and across the bridge of Walnut Street, and then came back up Market Street and onto MLK Boulevard and out onto I-95 and shut down traffic on I-95 for well over an hour. And what I kept hearing people say while we were out there is that, this is the only way we know anymore that we believe we might actually get a response, that people might pay attention, that if you shut down this arterial road, maybe people will listen. If you shut down this road that is the heart of so much of, frankly, the economy in our country, maybe we can get some attention and and hit them where it hurts in the economy and in their pockets, is what people were saying as we stood out there on the highway. And when the state troopers did arrive, which everyone obviously anticipated that they would, but when they did arrive, the response was interesting. They sent forward one Black trooper to speak to the leaders of the march, and they were having a conversation about why they were out there and what they were feeling and what they want to see change and how they believe we can get that change. And then right behind that kind of first line of troopers that came forward to speak were those, the massive SUVs all lined up, parked across every single lane of the highway. But what we started to notice was that just behind that line of those cars were a handful of troopers who were standing out there with long guns and these military grade rifles, and standing there just holding them, hands at the ready. And the question that I had for them was, why are those guns out? What was the protocol? How was the decision made to pull those guns out? Because that response is exactly why people were out on the highway in the first place. They were protesting that exact response to people's concerns. And that is the type of escalation that I think we're seeing across the country, where people are peacefully protesting, trying to get their voices heard because they are so tired of not being heard and of being killed. And the response is violence, is intimidation, and a reminder that at any moment your life can be taken by a police officer. And they didn't respond to me when I asked those questions. But I think that's an important question to ask. Why is that weapon out here? We have, I believe what I said to them is that we have water bottles and goldfish. We literally had goldfish crackers. And that, a woman driving by who, before we shut everything down, was very kind to drop off for us. But the response to people peacefully protesting is weapons at the ready. And it feels kind of ironic that in a response to police violence and police brutality, that's what we get. And, I think we're very grateful that did not escalate in that moment. I'm seeing today that things are continuing to escalate. I saw a video of protesters who were already handcuffed being tear gassed in Philly this afternoon. I saw protesters in Washington, D.C. being tear gassed this afternoon with lines of Capitol Police and military police lined up at the ready with guns drawn. And I think that's what a lot of people are seeing, and they're saying, well, if this is what we're out here protesting, how is it how you also respond? And I think that's kind of the point, is that it seems like no matter the situation, it's always being escalated by the response from police. And I think it's really important to talk about policing in our country, because it as an institution has been tied to racism and white supremacy since its formation. This is not something that's debatable. This is the truth. It was born, the police departments we have today were born out of protecting economic systems and capital, not protecting people. It came from protecting properties or businesses, and it came from slave catching, frankly, and trying to catch runaway enslaved people and return them to plantations in the South. We can't deny those roots. We have to acknowledge that, and we can't pretend that that's not the truth. And we have seen what we are seeing right now before. Whenever there have been uprisings, whenever protesters have tried to stand up for themselves and what they believe in and the rights that they have and deserve, it has been met by police violence. Whether those uprisings were for labor rights or civil rights or social justice, police have been used to protect capital and property and not people. And we're seeing it again when the escalations happen because someone breaks a window and people are shot at with, fine, you can say they're rubber bullets, you can say they're non-lethal, but I've seen quite a few terrible injuries from people being hit by those bullets. That's an escalation, and that's an escalation as a result of property damage. You're harming someone's life, you're risking taking someone's life over a broken window. So we see right now that today police departments across the country are sources of violence and white supremacy. And that is because they are highly militarized and they bring weapons and equipment that can cause mass death onto the streets of our towns and our cities. When in the city of Wilmington, what is called a Bearcat, because I had to look it up what this absurd vehicle is, when there are Bearcats, these armored vehicles that cost upwards of $250,000, are rolling down city streets, I think we really need to question what we're doing with policing. What role are they serving that they need these military weapons? I believe they don't. And these departments have become a source of white supremacy as white supremacists have infiltrated them. Many departments nationwide where white nationalists and white supremacists are able to act out their vision of harming and taking Black and brown lives through their role as police. And for years, we have seen activists and communities that are harmed the most by policing fight for reform. And the problem is that even in the few places that they have won, the results have been ineffective. The city of Minneapolis is a police department that has been through these attempts at reform. trainings and things like that to try to prevent exactly what happened last week from happening. And it did not work. There's a lack of transparency into police departments that makes it impossible for civilians and the public to hold them accountable. We have no visibility into what goes on. We have no visibility into the records or the reprimands that are made against officers. And these reform efforts that so many people have fought for, like body cameras, like de-escalation, like bias training, they have not stopped police violence and brutality. Like I said, Minneapolis is a perfect example of that. And what is most frustrating about it is that those ineffective measures, these reform efforts, they require us to invest even more in policing. When you need to purchase those body cameras, when you need to store the video from them, when you need to pay for the trainings and these consultants to come in and tell your cops how to recognize their implicit bias and how to de-escalate situations. Those things all cost money, and yet they're not working. And what could we be funding with that money otherwise? What could we be putting into the communities that need it the most? What resources or programming could we be providing for those funds that actually create public safety and actually raise the quality of life in their community? This is why reform is not going to work. It's why we can't fight the fight for reform of these departments. We see with our own eyes that it does not work. In the city of Wilmington, we have spent more and more on policing over the last 20 years, and crime has not decreased. It has continued to ups and downs, but overall increase. So I think it's time to try something else. And I think that involves admitting that if the goal of policing has been to keep the public safe, it is failing. And police departments are not equipped to deal with so many of the calls that they get when someone's in the midst of a mental health crisis, when someone is dealing with a substance abuse issue, people just suffering from the impact of poverty, which ends up being criminalized. And the calls that happen so often in my city are domestic violence calls. And when you put police into those situations, those are often the situations that end up escalating and becoming violent. So we need to have the real conversation about how we reimagine the function and methods of policing. And I think you really need to listen to anyone who is in a position of power right now in your city or state or federal government and listen to what they're saying. Because I've seen a lot of, oh, we're listening to you, we hear you, we see you. I've seen a lot of, we need to investigate what's going on here and figure it out. We have to study this. And I'm sorry, but those are bullshit answers. Like, we don't need to study this. We don't need to just listen anymore. We know what's going to make a difference. And what that is massively defunding the police. I encourage you to look at your city or your state budget and figure out how much money goes toward policing. In the city of Wilmington, it's about 40% of the budget is policing. What could we do with that money otherwise? What other programs could we be running? What are the community-based health and safety strategies that we can put in place with that money? Because the majority of people who live in communities who are suffering from police violence or over-policing recognize that the real reasons that there are crime in their neighborhoods are because of the defunding of schools, the removal of community centers, the lack of hope that their children see for their academic lives or their economic lives. These are the root causes of crime, and simply throwing more police at the problem is not going to solve those root causes. It never will. We have tried this for hundreds of years. It's time to do something else. So defunding is absolutely crucial. We should be putting that money into mental health resources, more public spaces, more community centers, ending the criminalization of poverty. What I mean by that is people who are homeless often end up locked up or being shuffled along by police and told to go somewhere else. And those are, again, situations that can escalate because that person is just tired. They're tired of being told that they can't stay where they are and yet offered nowhere else to go except for a jail cell. And we have to remember that the communities that have the least crime aren't the ones with the most police. They're the ones with the most resources. So how can we ensure that more of our communities have the resources we need to actually reduce crime? Next thing we have to do, I talked about the militarization of police. We absolutely need to ban military gear. These programs that have been set up by the federal government to allow police departments to purchase this militarized equipment and gear and vehicles need to be completely shut down. We need stronger background checks for our officers to ensure that white supremacists and white nationalists are not infiltrating law enforcement. We need to ensure that cops who commit brutality are actually disciplined and fired. You know, someone tweeted at me today that they drive a forklift for their job, and if they endanger a coworker or a customer's life, even hurt that person or come close to hurting them, they will lose their job. And they were questioning, why is that the standard for my job, but it's not the standard for someone who walks around with a gun on their hip and is supposed to keep people safe? And I think that's an incredibly good point. If you are someone who has brutalized the people you are supposed to keep safe, you should not continue to be on that job. And we need a national database to guarantee that those cops who are dismissed, who are reprimanded and removed from their duties, cannot then go be hired elsewhere. Because right now that information can go under lock and key and it doesn't get shared, and that person can be sent to harm yet another community. And these are the ways that we start to get toward transparency and accountability. We need independent community review boards so the community is actually able to make decisions about the police that are in their community. And we need to end things like qualified immunity that allow officers to get away with crimes and brutality. So my point there is that we have to keep having these conversations. We have to not just push for reform. Reform, we have seen, is not going to get it what we need. We know what we need. If the people that represent you in Congress and your state government and your city government aren't calling for these things, please pick up the phone. Please tell them this is what we need. I don't want to have to be in another march with people saying that they're afraid of their name becoming a hashtag ever again. And we can absolutely change this. This is not something that we have to live with. There are some more rallies and protests coming up. There's a couple. I just want to make sure I get these right. I'm going to look it up really quickly. So on Friday, there's two. In Sussex, the Southern Delaware Alliance for Racial Justice and the Women's March Sussex are hosting events along Route 1. And that's at 4 p.m. on Friday. And on Friday in Newcastle County at 6 p.m. at Tubman Garrett Riverfront Park in Wilmington, there will be another rally and protest there, which I intend to attend that one in Wilmington. I ate up a half hour of our live stream, and I'm not going to apologize for that because I think it's incredibly important what we just talked about, but I know that maybe that means we won't get through as many questions today, but I will try to hit on as many as you've given me. So let me check out what's happening here. All right, Jeffrey asks, I just moved to Delaware. What are the main adversities here? What's interesting is that I talk about this a lot in an interview when people ask me about like what's Delaware like, you know, if we're having a national conversation, and I often say that Delaware is in some ways a microcosm of the entire country. We have, you know, that I mean that in the sense of both like the types of communities we have. We go from very urban areas to very rural areas. We have beaches, we have farming, we have suburban areas. So we have sort of that wide breadth of even like geological landscape. But you also see so many of the things that are affecting people day in and day out across the country here in Delaware. Some of them to a more extreme degree. So economic inequality is one of those things. The inequality that we see from an economic standpoint, wealth as well as income, is extreme here. You know, we have these, I think at least 6 of the, you know, headquarters of some of the biggest banks around our entire downtown area, up and down sort of, you know, Market Street and King Street. And you take a walk really in either direction from those streets, and you'll walk into some of the most under-resourced and ignored neighborhoods. And to live in the shadow of these banks that are, you know, worth billions and billions of dollars, when you can't get the sidewalks fixed in your neighborhood or the roads fixed in your neighborhood, is such an extreme dichotomy that we see here in our state. The other thing that is incredibly indicative and important here is environment and climate change. Delaware is the lowest lying state in the country, and it is particularly vulnerable to climate change for that reason. And as always, these things are especially true in lower income areas. So there's a neighborhood in Wilmington here called Southbridge that sees flooding regularly, particularly, you know, after a storm. And they're going to be the first community hit if we see sea level rise and water tables rise. They'll lose their homes and their lands the fastest. And the same thing goes for downstate. You know, we're already seeing that if there's a storm out to sea, it doesn't even have to be raining here, and we'll see tides come in and wash out roads and take over roads. We see the beaches get destroyed after these storms come through, and the beach replenishment that we have to do because of that. We have issues with water quality in our state that is both from natural reasons, but predominantly from corporate polluters. You know, the history of having so many chemical companies in our state who have left these forever chemicals behind is one thing. And then it's still going on with, for example, the chicken processing plants that exist downstate, who are actively harming the people who live around them and poisoning their wells with the runoff of feces and waste from their plants. Education in our state is yet another thing that we hear about it on a national level, but it's even more extreme here. We have an incredible amount of inequality in our education. We spend more than other states, but are getting worse outcomes because of the way that funding flows predominantly to wealthy communities. We don't have funding in our state that accounts for whether a student is learning English language or coming from a low-income neighborhood, typically students who need more attention, and dollars that go towards those students could help their outcomes, but we don't do that here. So I hear quite a bit from people about their concerns about education in our state. Similar to what we were talking about before, criminal justice system, we have, as I said, we see this with our own eyes. The criminal justice system and policing in Delaware is classist and racist. In a state where Black people make up only 20% of the population, They make up 60% of incarcerated people in our jails in our state. And that breaks communities and families. It makes it so that when that person does get out of jail, it's harder for them to ever get a job again, to ever make good wages, to ever be able to provide for themselves effectively. And that's what happens to people who are incarcerated, while we have officers in Wilmington PD, one officer in particular, who has, McCall, who has shot 2 people, was involved with shooting Jeremy McDowell, who died in 2016, and was involved last year with shooting Yaheem Harris. Yet this person was not removed from his job after shooting and killing a man, and then is allowed to leave that position and retire and continue to receive benefits. So we can see how this system is unjust, and these things that exist across the nation are felt particularly strongly here in our state. And it is why these are some of the most important pillars of the platform that I'm running on, because they're the things I hear from people most frequently. Which is a great segue into the next question. So, what are the criminal justice reform policies that you'd like to focus on to prevent violence like this from occurring? I think I did hit on this a little bit, but to go through it a little bit more, we need police departments that are accountable to the communities that they serve. They absolutely need to be demilitarized. I stand for completely removing those weapons, that gear, from police departments. And I really think that we need to redefine, or at least define, what policing does, what the function is of policing. Because we talk about public safety, we talk about preventing crime, and we don't see these things happening. So I really think we need to break this down to the studs and start from the bottom and say, what does this department do? And that gives us the opportunity to actually bring other roles into public safety, because I really support not just hiring cops. We need to also hire social workers and counselors and people who are trained to de-escalate situations, who are capable of handling some of the psychological issues that they may be encountering at the other end of a 911 call, some of the socioeconomic factors. These are not things that are the strengths of police. They are strengths of social workers. They are strengths of counselors. We need those people involved, frankly, on the majority of the calls that come into a 911 dispatch. I believe that if an officer does commit brutality or fails in their ability to de-escalate a situation and kill and murder someone, they need to be removed from their job. The standards that we apply to forklift drivers, I believe we can apply to our police. That if you harm someone, if you kill someone, you cannot continue to do this job. I talk about that even with that officer who killed Jeremy McDowell. Like, what counseling did he even get after going through something like that? That's a traumatic event. And to just be back out on the streets policing, like, that seems really short-sighted and misguided. So if you harm people in that role, I do not believe that you should be able to stay in that job. And I don't think the racism that's baked into policing can be handled simply through legislation. The roots of racism go so deep that simply making it illegal is not going to be enough. And that is why I think the cry for defunding has become so strong, particularly in response to what we're seeing this past week. because there's no short fix to racism, as we've seen. And when we continue to throw more and more money at these police departments, when we continue to outfit them like warriors, what are we telling them? What are we saying that this system has become? If you're given the trappings of a soldier, why wouldn't you feel like an occupying force? Why wouldn't you feel like a soldier defending a territory, or frankly invading or occupying a territory? And when you mix that with the inherent racism in our culture and in some of these people who are actually white supremacists, it's clearly a deadly combination. So while I do believe that taking away that gear helps, it's not going to solve the racism piece. And that's why defunding and having this more multifaceted approach that actually centers the needs of people in the most police communities is what I believe and many people are fighting for now as the best path forward, and actually investing in making sure that our schools are more equal, and then we're not closing schools in the poorest neighborhoods in our cities, that people aren't living in such poverty that crime is an option, that you can make more money doing that versus actually having a job. When our minimum wages are so low, and even not just minimum, when wages are so stagnant, people are stuck in poverty. And then when we criminalize things like taillights being broken and headlights being out and things that people can't fix because they literally don't have the money, but they need that car and they need to keep driving it to get to work. And then let's say they lose that license because they didn't deal with that broken headlight, but they still need to keep getting to work, and then they get pulled over on that suspended license. This is what criminalizing poverty is. So we need to do things that lift people out of poverty and actually solve that problem rather than trying to police that problem. We need to invest in things that make our communities healthier, from both the air that they breathe and the water that they drink, and then also the health care that they're able to receive. And that's medical care and it's mental care, because this is what actually makes communities safe. Like, safety is not this single, it's not a singular thing. There's so many facets to it. You're safer when you and your neighbors are well educated. You're safer when you and your neighbors are making good money and able to sustain their lives and have a good standard of living. You're safer when you're healthier. These are the things that we can be putting our public money into. So Maggie asked specifically about what's the plan to end the pipeline of military police. So there are actual programs at the federal level that have been put in place. They are called the 1033 program and the 1122 program, and they are structured to essentially funnel these militarized gear and weapons and equipment into our towns and our cities. So these are actually pieces of the National Defense Authorization Act. And when we expanded Homeland Security, there was this effort to bring Homeland Security into urban areas, and local police departments essentially became militarized forces as a result of those. So those are the specific programs that we would fight to end, and by doing that, that's what shuts down the ability that's what shuts down the kind of channels they have right now. But I think on top of that, there should be a ban on local police departments owning that gear, because the programs allow the facilitation of it and the funding of it, but simply shutting that down. We have to make sure that we're also saying you can't have this at all. So you can't even just raise the money yourself. You can't get a very wealthy benefactor who will buy you one of these Bearcat tank vehicles, armored vehicles. So I think it's both shutting down the programs that facilitate it, as well as saying that the ownership of this gear is not allowed. So next question is, what are your thoughts on the statements of Donald Trump declaring Antifa a terrorist organization? Which Derek asked. You know, I'm going to call out my husband for a minute. Sorry, Bill. But that's kind of one thing I was talking about before I came upstairs to start this live stream. And we had a little bit of a disagreement on it, because I thought he was being a bit too dismissive of it. And I think that we absolutely cannot be dismissive of a statement like that, because, you know, a lot of people keep saying, like, oh, Donald Trump doesn't even have the power to do that, like he cares. Or, well, Antifa's not even a group. Like, who are they going to say is in it? Like, no one's even actually in it. There's no organization. Like, he cares. Like, this is something that I think we have become pretty desensitized to the things that Donald Trump says and does over, frankly, since he started his campaign in 2015. And many of them, frankly, are laughable, but I don't think this is one of them. I think this is actually very scary, because he has been escalating along these lines, and making these increasingly inflammatory statements. And, you know, I think this is not the time to say that we don't take this seriously. You know, what was that bit? It would always be like, take him seriously or not literally or whatever. Like, this one I'm taking both seriously and literally, because the very nature of Antifa, which is literally just being against fascism, something I would hope we can all embrace. The fact that it's not a defined group, the fact that there aren't, you know, headquarters and membership cards, makes it actually much scarier, because people in the Trump administration can simply label someone a member of the group and label them a terrorist and strip their civil rights. And I think that as this is something we should be incredibly fearful of, and incredibly again, standing up to and calling out. This is not something that I think we should just let slide by. We have given more executive power to we've given more power to the executive branch over many administrations now, and I think Donald Trump is the last person, and the people that surround him are the last types of people that you want having that power. But you know, the fact that we have been extending that power, that executive power, or that the allowance of these more authoritarian moves in the name of security and privacy has just continued to escalate. And I think, you know, I won't say it started with the Bush administration, but that's kind of, you know, when it first came to light, and for me, is the fact that we have an authorization of use of military force that was started under Bush's administration, and just gave him the ability to use military force with being to work around Congress. These are things that have centralized power with essentially one person in our government, and I think that is something that I have been disappointed to see the failure of Congress to rein back in the last however many years, 15 plus years, because I think we cannot have an executive branch that is running out of control like it is now, particularly when you put someone like Donald Trump and the people who surround him in power. So this is, I don't know precisely what we can do to counter that action of him naming Antifa a terrorist organization. However, I don't think it's something that we should be dismissive of, and I think that we need to be very cognizant of how that might be used. And I think it again simply adds to the things that people should be angry and in the streets about right now. All right, so Bailey asked, on your platform you mentioned quality public education for all people in the U.S. no matter their zip code. What pathways do you see towards ensuring that schools have the resources that they need? Great question. I do absolutely stand by that zip code should not determine the education that you get, though it does right now. Full stop. That's just the truth. The way that I think we fix that is dramatically increasing funding from the federal government for public education. Right now, I think that it is something that the federal government doesn't take or prioritize nearly enough. And what ends up happening there is that it leaves states to fill that gap and to fund their schools entirely on their own. But from the federal government, we could be making much stronger investment in our public education, because the problem with leaving it to the states is that the states only have essentially the predominant tool that they use is property taxes. And when you fund your schools via property taxes, they are inherently unequal and they are localized. They're inherently unequal because property values are inherently unequal. Talking before about how we have so many under-resourced communities and neighborhoods, well, the values of homes are also lower in those neighborhoods. So the taxes that people pay on those homes is also lower in those neighborhoods or those zip codes. So you just raise less money in the districts where you actually need the most money, where you need the most help. And because of the way that we localize it and we predominantly keep money that's raised in a district in the district, there's not a lot of tools that the state has to help out those lower income and under-resourced districts, which is why the federal government can actually exist to fill those gaps and should exist to fill those gaps. I think the other thing that's incredibly important is centering the students who need the most resources. A lot of our schools are not equipped to handle special needs students and low income students or students who are experiencing trauma, and it harms the education that those students get. And part of the reason that they're not equipped to do so is because a lot of times schools are understaffed. A lot of schools may not even have a full-time counselor or social worker, or may not have enough aides, may have situations where they have building constraints or teacher constraints, so classroom sizes are incredibly large, and then those students who need the most help aren't able to get it. Those are those students that we need to be thinking about when we are deciding where funding goes and how it's used and how we even build out our classes. And with what we're seeing right now, I mean, so many students have even fallen behind because of coronavirus and being forced to get schooling from home. However, this is particularly true in Delaware, there's a real issue when it comes to internet connectivity. I believe that the internet needs to be a public utility, needs to be available in every single home, and like a public utility, should not be a for-profit enterprise, because internet is becoming just as important as the water that you get in your home and the gas or the electric that you use to heat it or turn on your lights. And students who come from homes where they can't afford internet service or are not able to get high-speed internet service, which is true for a lot of the communities, particularly downstate in Delaware, those students are at a disadvantage. Again, inherently at a disadvantage. They're not able to do the same type of research that students with internet are. That's another way which the background that you come from can affect the education that you get. The other piece is that I think and this kind of comes into the same thing with expanding funding, is that I really believe that we have to think about our schools as the center of communities, that the strength of that community grows out from, that those schools include full services, wraparound services. So that's the things you would expect, like including free daily lunches for students and ensuring that the social services and that are required for students and the resources for students are exist. But that also means making the school itself into a community center that's available to the community, that has services or programming even for adults that can help advance the welfare of families. Some things that schools have started doing is actually running food banks in their own schools for the students who need food when they're at home, or opening laundromats up in their schools for the students who need their clothes to be cleaned at school. So there are ways that I think we can actually change the face of a neighborhood and the strength of a neighborhood by actually investing in the schools that exist in that neighborhood. And those are some of the things that I would fight to actually have the federal government be focused on. Okay. Adam asked, how have protests affected your campaign? It hasn't stopped us from campaigning. I think the conversations have changed a little bit. I think I've even before protests started, in reaction to Ahmaud Arbery being killed in the street by two people who thought he was a criminal, when Breonna Taylor was killed by police storming her apartment, even though they were at the wrong place. That started to change the conversation people had. So things like racial justice started coming up more, and criminal justice started coming up more, and police started to come up more. So I think it's maybe shifted the priority of things that people want to talk about. But I will say that criminal justice, policing, racial justice were all things that came up frequently anyway. But I think, again, it's what's top of mind. Much like at the onset of the pandemic, healthcare was incredibly top of mind. Wages and job security and paid leave were top of mind. I think, obviously the conversations are shifting, but it's not that it wasn't a conversation we were having already. And I haven't had any conversations about the protests themselves, one way or the other. That's not what's really coming up. It's more about the police brutality and that being centered in conversations more. Do you believe that all drugs should be decriminalized or legalized? I definitely believe that drug use should be decriminalized. I think that drug use should be considered a public health issue, if you want to call it an issue. Marijuana should absolutely be legalized. I think that I know we spend billions of dollars policing marijuana in our country every year, locking people up on marijuana charges, and it could be a multi-billion-dollar industry in our country. And you'll hear people like my opponent say that we need to study marijuana more and understand the effects that it has on the brain before we legalize it. But that is actually a talking point from people like the pharmaceutical industry who oppose legalization of marijuana, because they recognize, and it has been shown, that when you legalize medical marijuana, when you legalize marijuana as a whole, the use of things like opioids and other painkillers, anxiety medications, all of their products, the use of those products decreases. So I think whenever you see someone who opposes the legalization of marijuana in particular, it's always important to check their political contributions, because that is an opinion that is completely out of step with the public, and it's usually being influenced by pharmaceutical donors to their campaign. LeVar says, what type of lawmaker will you be if elected? Which is a great question. I talked about this a little bit, where I've said that I really want to use the power that you have as a senator differently than I think it has been used before. I think that, I will absolutely fight and center the issues of low income and working class people in our country in the Senate, which is something that can really be missing, particularly from that body where, the average wealth is in the multi-millions. There really needs to be more voices who are speaking for working people in our country. I also really want to use the power that comes with that seat to empower others and to raise up the voices of organizers and activists and voices that are currently marginalized and not heard from in our government, and ensure that it's not just me going off to Washington for however, for sessions and not being back here and not remaining connected to the people who are doing the work to fight for working class people. Because there are so many community organizers and labor organizers and tenants organizers and activists who are doing all of that work, but you don't see them being lifted up by people in the Senate in particular. And if we are going to make change in this country, we have to be working both inside and outside our government. And I think that is the difference that I see, is that I would have no problem with using my power or my email list or my connections to reach out and activate people to stand up and fight for something and raise their voices and call other senators and call other Congress people and show up in states at state houses or at the offices of their members of Congress. Because I think that's how you actually get things done. I don't think it can just be me going to Washington and saying, I'll solve this problem, you guys stay home, you'll be fine, I'll catch up with you later. I think it really has to be about, I'm going to do the work in the body, in the legislative body, and I need you guys to do the work on the streets, and here's how we can coordinate that work and work together and make sure that we are bringing the same message forward and we are hitting on that message, not only here in Delaware, but across the country and in states where maybe there's a more apprehensive senator but that we think we can win over. How do we activate people in that state to get them to do that? So I really see this as an opportunity to have much more of an activist mindset in the Senate, and I really believe that's our best chance at making change. And I think that it can't just be we send people to Washington and we check in 6 years and see how they did. It has to be much more of an interactive approach to legislating and to moving our country forward. Alright, so right before I finish, I want to hit on just a couple more questions before I have some closing notes. Okay. Nadia asked, who are some of your favorite authors? And she said Horizon Expanding Ones, which is a great question. Trying to think of what I really loved last year. I pick up every single book that Zadie Smith writes, so she's an absolute favorite of mine. there was a book, I believe it was his first book, Tommy Orange, who's a indigenous author from the States, and he wrote a wonderful book called There that I believe was his first, and I'm looking forward to seeing what he does next. That came out a couple years ago, which was a book that it does this thing that I love, where it's it's a bunch of little vignettes, and then they all kind of tie together as the story continues on. So that is just a device that I really enjoy. So I really enjoyed that book and his work. I'm trying to think. I've been reading the Karl Narsgaard books, which I really enjoy them. They're kind of just his thousands and thousands of pages of his memoirs. He's a Norwegian author, and they're not, I won't say they're necessarily horizon expanding, but they're such a wonderful lens into the daily pieces of his life from his childhood through his adulthood, and I just really enjoy that, the humanity that comes through in them. I like a lot of I read a lot of fiction, so I like some of the classics that were by Philip K. Roth. My husband and I were actually should I say K? Philip Roth. Who else? I'm sitting in my library. You think I'd be able to come up with actual authors? I'm looking around. I'm trying to find the one that I was thinking of. This is fun to watch me look at my books. Where is it? Oh, I like this one. This was A Brief History of Seven Killings by Marlon James. Set in Jamaica, surrounding the death of Bob Marley. Again, fictionalized, but really wonderful story. Kind of written with patois, so a little hard to get through, but wonderful story. And then where's the other one that I really liked? Oh, this is fun for everyone. I can't find it. It's big. I should be able to see it. Oh, it's up there. A Little Life by Hanya. I believe her name is Yanagara. Her last name Yanagara. That was that book I always refer to as the book that I love so much but would never recommend to anyone, because it's just such a heartbreaking and heart-wrenching story. But I genuinely enjoyed it, but it hurts me to recommend it to someone. And then one that I read last year that I really liked, and I'm sorry that I cannot remember the name of the author, but it was called The Overstory, and it was, again, another one that kind of has a bunch of little vignettes that kind of come together, but they were all about environmentalism, essentially, and different people's kind of interactions with the environment. And that was a really beautiful story that made me want to go plant trees everywhere. So I think that's where I'll end. Probably last things just to close out. Kind of stopping where I started. I really think it's important that we thank all of the Black activists and Black organizers who have been putting together these protests that are happening right now, but have also been putting in the work for all of these years. The protests that I have seen have really, I think we're at, I want to say that we're at the end of something and the beginning of something else. I think it feels different than 2014. The things that people are calling for are different than 2014 Ferguson and the response to Mike Brown, and it's more widespread. And I hope that the work that they've been doing will pay off in the change that we can make. And I think it's incredibly important to find a way to help that work. It could be that you have resources to support a bail fund. It could be that you join a protest yourself. It could be that, you share what's going on and you share the stories of other people. I think like just the work of even photographers this weekend, in getting the visibility of what's happening out. So there's a way that you can help this. I'm sure you have a skill. I'm sure you at least have a voice with the ability to go out and march if you can. And I think that it's important to use whatever skill you can right now to advance this movement and to support the work that so many Black activists have been doing for so many years and are doing right now in this moment. I think my team will put together a list of more local, like Delaware focused things that you can donate to locally or places. So we'll make sure that we share that so that we can support the people who are doing this work in these communities right now. And we are still phone banking every day. We're still predominantly checking in. We're still making sure that people are doing okay during coronavirus. It feels like that has taken a back seat to protest, but we have to remember that that is still going on and people are still struggling and feeling the effects of that. So we are continuing to do that. Make sure that they have the resources they need and that their family needs. And still have these conversations about everything we talked about tonight, how important it still is. And these are great conversations. I really enjoy just jumping into our phone banking Slack channel most days because it's where the volunteers who are phone banking share the stories that they're hearing, and it's always so uplifting and it's always so inspiring to just hear about the people in this state and the work that they're doing, and they share so many real intimate stories with us when we're phone banking, and I think that connection is so important to me and to the work that we do. So please help us phone bank. You can do that and sign up to do that by going to jessfordelaware.com/volunteer. And if you're able to donate, your dollars help us reach more people. I like to remind people that, digital campaigning is more expensive than campaigning in person. Every phone call that we make costs us money. Every digital ad that we put out costs us money. So your dollars help us reach more people. $1 means 18 calls that we can make to voters. So every dollar genuinely makes a difference. So you can do that by visiting jessfordelaware.com/donate. Thank you so much. I know this has been a tough week, but please find a way to use the energy and the emotion and the feeling that you have to advance the cause that we are all championing and that we are all in support of. And I'll see you next week. Please share with your friends, invite other people to come, please RSVP to the event. That's another way you can help for free. That gives us more exposure when you share it and you invite your friends. So please do that, and I will talk to you in another 7 days. Take care, stay safe, be a part of the fight, and thanks so much.